Someone stole 500,000 tons of copper. Not from a vault, not from a bank. From the earth itself, from the shores of a lake in what is now the American Midwest, over the course of 4,000 years. And the strangest part isn't the scale of it. The strangest part is this. We found the mines. We found the tools. We found the pits, the hammerstones, the fire-setting scars in the rock. We found everything except the copper. 1.5 billion pounds of the purest copper ever to exist on this planet. Copper so clean it registered above 99% purity, was pulled out of the ground between roughly 3000 BCE and 1200 BCE. That is a longer operation than the entire span of the Roman Empire, longer than the time between the fall of Rome and right now. And, at the end of it, almost none of that copper remained in North America. So, where did it go? That is the question that has quietly haunted archaeologists, geologists, and historians for over a century. And in the last decade, a set of findings has begun to point toward an answer so strange, so inconvenient for the official timeline of human history, that mainstream academia has largely chosen not to address it directly. Today, we're going to follow the copper. We're going to trace it from the bedrock of Lake Superior all the way to the swords, armor, and palace walls of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. And when we get there, you'll understand why the people who know about this don't talk about it much. Let's begin at the scene of the crime. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan doesn't look like the center of one of history's greatest mysteries. From the air, it's mostly forest. Dark green pines stretching to the horizon, broken by the cold blue of Lake Superior, the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, cold enough to preserve shipwrecks for centuries. But if you know where to look, on the Keweenaw Peninsula and on Isle Royale, a wilderness island that sits 80 kilometers from the nearest shore, the land tells a different story. There are pits everywhere, not natural formations, not erosion. Deliberate excavations, some reaching 6 meters deep, carved into bedrock by human hands. More than 5,000 open mine pits have been identified across the Lake Superior Copper District. The oldest of them have been dated to at least 5,000 BCE. Some evidence suggests activity going back even further. These are the oldest known copper mines in the Western Hemisphere. And the tools are still there. Thousands of rounded granite cobbles, hand-selected for weight and hardness, still lie at the bottom of many pits and in the surrounding debris. These were the hammers. Ancient miners carried them to the site, used them to break copper-bearing rock, and when a cobble cracked, they picked up another one. Archaeologists have recovered hammerstones weighing anywhere from 1 to 10 kilograms. Some pits contain hundreds of them. The fire-setting evidence is also visible in the rock face itself. Ancient miners would build large fires directly against the rock, heating it until it became brittle, then douse it suddenly with cold water from the lake. The thermal shock would crack the stone, exposing the copper veins beneath. You can still see the scorch patterns in the bedrock today. Now stop for a moment and do the math. 1.5 billion pounds of copper, extracted with granite cobbles and controlled fires. At a conservative estimate of 10 kilograms of copper per worker per day, which is actually generous for this method, you are looking at a sustained workforce of tens of thousands of people operating for centuries. This was not a subsistence activity. This was not occasional tool-making by wandering hunter-gatherers. This was an industrial operation. The kind of operation that requires organization, supply chains, food logistics to support a workforce that is not growing its own food because it's too busy mining. The kind of operation that implies, even demands, a level of social complexity that our standard narrative of prehistoric North America has never comfortably accommodated. And here is where the first strange thing happens. The people responsible for this, the culture archaeologists call the Old Copper Complex, left behind extraordinary artifacts. Copper spear points, copper fishhooks, copper awls and gouges of remarkable precision. Copper tools so well made that when 19th century analysts first examined them, they assumed they were recent forgeries because the craftsmanship seemed too advanced. They were not forgeries. The Old Copper Complex was real and skilled and organized. And then, around 1200 BCE, they stopped. Not gradually, not slowly winding down over generations. The mines went quiet. The tools were left behind, exactly where they'd been working, as if the workers simply walked away one day and never came back. By 1000 BCE, large-scale copper extraction at Lake Superior had effectively ceased. For 3,000 years after that, the mines sat untouched. The forest grew back over the pits. The hammerstones stayed where they'd been dropped. The copper, however, was gone. Let's be precise about what gone means here, because the number is almost too large to process. Geological surveys of the Lake Superior Copper District have established that the ancient mines extracted somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 metric tons of native copper. For context, the entire output of the Roman Empire's copper mines over 5 centuries of operation is estimated at roughly 15,000 metric tons. Lake Superior's prehistoric miners extracted 30 to 50 times that amount. Now, how much of it remained in North America when European explorers arrived in the 1600s? Archaeologists have cataloged every copper artifact recovered from North American sites up to the time of European contact: tools, ornaments, ceremonial objects, burial goods. Add it all up, and you get a number that historians have described as embarrassingly small relative to the extraction volume. Less than 1% of the extracted copper can be accounted for in the North American archaeological record. Think about what that means. If you extracted 1 billion pounds of copper, and you can only find 10 million pounds of it in the region where it was mined, the other 990 million pounds went somewhere else. Not buried and not yet found. Archaeologists have been working this region intensively for 150 years. The kind of mass storage site that could account for hundreds of thousands of tons of copper would not have escaped detection. The copper didn't stay in North America, which means someone moved it. The Bronze Age in Europe is one of the most important periods in human history. Between roughly 3300 BCE and 1200 BCE, civilizations across the Mediterranean transformed their technology, their warfare, and their economies through bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. So, the central question of Bronze Age economics is, where did all the copper come from? The standard answer has always been Cyprus. But here is the problem that Bronze Age researchers have quietly struggled with for decades. The isotope signatures don't match. When metallurgists analyze Bronze Age artifacts from Europe, swords, helmets, ingots, jewelry, and trace the chemical fingerprint of the copper used, they find a puzzling result. A substantial portion of this copper cannot be traced to any known European or Near Eastern source. The ratio of lead isotopes, the trace element profile, it doesn't match Cyprus. It doesn't match Sardinia. It doesn't match the Sinai. It matches Lake Superior. This finding has been published. It has been peer-reviewed. And it has been, for the most part, quietly set aside, because the implications are considered too radical. The conventional model of Bronze Age history does not include transatlantic contact. Acknowledging that Lake Superior copper ended up in European Bronze Age artifacts would require rewriting the story of how civilization developed, who was talking to whom, and what human beings were capable of doing on the open ocean 4,000 years ago. So instead, researchers describe the isotopic match as anomalous and move on. But the anomaly doesn't go away. If Lake Superior copper did reach Bronze Age Europe, someone had to move it. And at the peak of the Lake Superior mining operation, roughly 2000 to 1200 BCE, there was exactly one civilization in the ancient world with the maritime capability, the commercial motivation, and the geographic reach to conduct transatlantic trade. The Minoans. Based on the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization was the dominant naval and trading power in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. They were merchants. Their ships were fast, their navigation was sophisticated, and their trade network stretched from Egypt to the British Isles. Bronze was their product. Copper, in massive, industrial quantities, was what they needed more than anything. Now consider what was found at the Lake Superior mining sites, among the artifacts recovered from ancient campsites near the Peninsula mines. Sites that date to the period of peak copper extraction. Archaeologists found ceramic sherds displaying stylistic and technical characteristics strikingly similar to Minoan pottery from the same period. This evidence is contested. It is not settled science. But here is the fact that is very difficult to explain away. The Lake Superior copper mines shut down around 1200 BCE. The Minoan civilization collapsed around 1200 BCE. These are not approximate dates. They are the same event horizon. The same moment in history when the entire Bronze Age world fell apart. When the sea peoples swept through the eastern Mediterranean, when the Mycenaean palaces burned, when the trade routes collapsed. If the Minoans were the ones moving Lake Superior copper across the Atlantic, then when the Bronze Age trade network collapsed in 1200 BCE, the demand for that copper would have vanished overnight, and the mines would have gone quiet, exactly as they did. The timing is not proof, but it is the kind of coincidence that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. The old copper complex culture, the people who built and operated those mines for thousands of years, did not simply continue living in the Great Lakes region after the mining stopped. Genetic and archaeological analysis of the region from roughly 1500 BCE onward shows a significant disruption. The populations that archaeologists can trace through the old copper complex period appear to have declined sharply or dispersed. The cultural continuity breaks. New groups arrive from different directions. Some researchers have suggested epidemic disease. Some suggest climate disruption around 1200 BCE. Others have suggested something more uncomfortable, that the logistics of extracting 1 billion pounds of copper were not purely the work of local people, but involved outsiders who came, organized extraction, and left when the trade route died. This theory has no broad academic support. It is, in many circles, considered fringe. But the Ojibwe people, who have lived in the Lake Superior region for centuries, have oral traditions that speak of an earlier people, different people, who knew the copper and worked it before the Ojibwe arrived. These traditions do not describe ancestors, they describe strangers. History has not always been kind to oral traditions, but in this case the oral record and the archaeological record agree. Someone was here, they extracted an incomprehensible amount of copper, and then they were gone. So what do we actually know? We know that between 3000 and 1200 BCE at Lake Superior, someone extracted more copper than the Roman Empire ever produced, using nothing but stone hammers and fire. We know that almost none of that copper remained in North America. We know that Bronze Age Europe consumed copper in quantities that its known mines cannot fully explain. We know that the isotope signature of a significant portion of Bronze Age European copper matches Lake Superior. We know that the Minoan civilization collapsed at precisely the moment the Lake Superior mines went silent. And we know that for 150 years, the academic establishment has called this collection of facts anomalous, and has declined to connect the dots. The standard model of human prehistory depends on a particular story, that the ancient world was a collection of isolated civilizations, developing independently, incapable of sustained contact across the Atlantic Ocean before Columbus. The Lake Superior copper problem does not fit that story, but the copper went somewhere. And somewhere, right now, there is a Bronze Age sword in a museum, in London, in Athens, in Istanbul, whose atoms were once locked in the rock beneath Lake Superior, whose making was once the work of hands we will never know, standing on the edge of a cold lake in a forest that did not yet have a name. The tools are still there at Lake Superior. You can visit Royale today, a U.S. national park, and see the ancient pits. The hammerstones have been preserved. The fire scars are still visible in the rock. The copper is not there. The people are not there, but the question remains, and it is a question about more than copper. It is a question about what we allow ourselves to believe about the past, about who we decide was capable of what, about which anomalies we choose to investigate and which ones we label contested and file away. Every great historical revision began with someone refusing to accept that an anomaly was just a coincidence. The Bronze Age was built on copper. The world's largest prehistoric copper operation ran for 4,000 years in the middle of North America, and then it stopped, simultaneously with the collapse of the only civilization that needed it badly enough to cross an ocean to get it. Make of that what you will. If you've made it this far, what do you think happened to the copper? Leave your answer below. And if you want to go deeper, the next video follows the copper into Europe. Which artifacts, which museums, which swords may have started their existence on the shores of Lake Superior? That video is already up. The link is in the description. See you there.